Hello there, my name's Mike Pelton. That is me in the photograph, and that is my email address, mpelton@microsoft.com. So if none of this makes any sense, do feel free to ping me a mail. Now I'm going to talk to you about a new component that's arrived in, it's really in Framework 2, but we see it as part of Visual Studio 2005, and it solves a problem you may not know you had. There is a rule in terms of putting long-running activities into background threads that's widely ignored by those of us who program under XP. What you must never do is to write from your background worker thread back to the thread that's running the user interface. And typically under XP you can do this with impunity, but it is bad. Every one running in 100, your application will fail mysteriously, and of course that's always when somebody's looking at you or when you're demoing it to your customer or whatever. It's to do with a thread marshalling effect. There is a solution to it from Framework 1.1, and I'll point you to an article a little later on that talks you through the steps that you have to go through. But it's actually quite fiddly, and it was felt that some of that fiddliness could be wrapped up more effectively into a component, and that component's called the background worker. And so again, without further ado, what we'll do is give you a quick insight into how to use the background worker. Right, so let's create a new project, file new project. We'll create a Windows application, so Windows application 12, and there's my form, and we can just open the toolbox and pop a couple of things on it. Let's pin the toolbox, in fact. So we're going to have a button, keeping with all the best applications, so a nice big button, and we'll have a status strip along the bottom. As a status strip, we'll put a couple of things onto the status strip. So one will be a status label called tool strip status label 1, and the other will be a progress bar. And critically, we're going to put a background worker component onto here. So here it is. Let's put the background worker component on. You'll see that positions itself in the tray because it's a component. And I can set some properties on the background worker. So we'll say it reports progress. We'll set that to true. Worker supports cancellation. We'll set that to true. And in terms of events, we're going to hook some of the events that it fires. So it fires a working event. So we'll say on do work. It fires a progress changed event, so we'll say on progress changed, and it fires a completed event as well, so we'll just say on completed to hook that. Now I haven't got a handle yet for my button being pushed, so let's double click on that, and we've got some code now to deal with that event as well. Now we'll set our label initially to say it's .text. As soon as we click the button, we'll say that we're working. We should actually initialize it, I suppose, at the start of the form startup and say that it's actually ready. And in fact, we'll also say that we're ready again when our work's completed. So we'll pop that down here as well. So that's my labeling behaving itself. And to actually start up our long-running activity on a background thread, we call a method on the background worker, which is background worker 1.runWorkerAsync, and that deals with all the thread management. And you'll notice the comment here in undo work. This has been injected by Visual Studio, saying be sure not to manipulate any Windows Forms controls created on the UI thread from this method. We're not going to do that. We're going to create a loop, so we say for int I equals 1, I is less than 11, you'll see why I'm doing this in a second, I++, and I'm going to put the thread to sleep just so we can give the impression of some long working event. I use the new refactoring capabilities to resolve the fact that the thread lives in using system.threading. So that's been stuck in at the top of the piece of code there, which is probably my favourite feature. And we'll sleep the thread for 500 milliseconds. And now I'm going to report my progress. So I'll say background worker 1.report progress, and you may be able to see that this is looking for a percentage of progress. So we'll say I star 10, hence the rather exotic numbering on my loop there. So that's my long running activity, sleeping its thread and reporting its progress. When my progress changes, I'm actually back in safe country so far as the threading is concerned. So I can say tools strip status label 1, there it is. It's tool strip progress label I'm interested in. Ooh, he's all over the place now. The value, the extent to which I'm, how far my activity's got, is passed down in the progress changed event args package here. So we can just say e dot progress percentage, and that is probably all we need. So we've got something happening in all of our events. In fact, we'll perhaps set our value back to 0 when we're completed, just to complete the whole thing. Let's run this and see what happens. So here's our application. I press my button. You see the text there has changed to working, and there's my long-running process executing, and it's gone back to ready at the end. And my user interface is responsive while all of this is going on. As I wiggle the user interface there, you can still see that external thread's operating. And so that's the base principle of how the background worker component works. As you can see, it's incredibly straightforward. I'm going to point you in a second to articles by both Chris Sells and Michael Weinhardt that explore in fascinating depth issues of calculating digits for pi. And both of them have implemented code that actually deals with this issue of calculating digits of pi. Chris Sells did it as we were obliged to do it in framework 10 and 11 using invokes to make sure they're on the correct thread. Michael Weinhardt's taken the exact same problem and addressed it using the background worker component, and he produced the example that we're seeing here. If you compare the code of these two articles, then you can see just how simple things become with the background worker component. But let's calculate some digits of pi. So I'm calculating 1,000 digits of pi here, and you can see this clearly this is an intensive process, but as I move the user interface around, it remains responsive, and I can hit the cancel button and finish it at any time. There we go, you can see that running again. So we're doing this in a very thread safe way. That's the critical thing. So there we go. So by way of summary, that was the background worker control in action. It addresses a very important issue. You should never write from a background worker thread to your user interface. So just as we were setting text properties and so on, you shouldn't ever do that stuff from your background worker thread. We didn't really explore, but you can also deal with interrupting your background worker thread. So the user wants to terminate that long-running process. It's very straightforward. And of course, in this era of multi-core machines and multi-processor machines, working with threads to park long-running processors onto them becomes even more important in terms of exploiting performance. Now, I promised you a couple of references. Let's see if we can do that. So the first is out to the original article that dealt with this whole issue of calculating the digits of pi and dealing with the thread management issues through that long-running process. And that was originally written by a gentleman called Chris Sells, who is now a Microsoft employee, wasn't at the time, but wrote this article called Safe Simple Multi-Threading in Windows Forms. And that talks through the clever things that you have to do calling invoke to make sure that you're actually addressing the correct thread when you update the user interface. Now, Michael Weinhardt has written a subsequent article called Safe Even Simpler Multi-Threading in Windows Forms, which uses the background worker component to address this exact same problem. And it's fascinating how little code Michael Weinhardt needed by comparison with Chris Sells' original example. So I can absolutely heartily recommend having a look at those articles, both very well written and very interesting. More generally, if you're interested in Visual Studio 2005 development, there's a pointer out there to the Developer Center. And as I said at the beginning, if none of this makes any sense at all, do feel free to ping me a mail and I'll do what I can to help. Anyway, thanks for your time.